Hey, okay, so today I want to talk a little bit about my writing process, which I finally have. Processes are one of those things that everyone, like you go to a conference or you listen to a podcast and these amazing creators talk about their process, and you sit there thinking, okay, so I don't have a process, so that obviously means I'm a failure. But as of very recently, I feel like I can actually say I have figured out a way to write that works for me. And I don't recommend it. So usually I start with an idea, and they usually just pop into my head, and then by the next day I'll have created this random world, and then I spend some time, just sort of thinking about it, and that helps me decide whether or not it's something that I want to pursue. So I love coffee. I like thinking in coffee metaphors. And so I say that I let these ideas percolate. So they're just, sitting in the hopper. The hopper? No, that's where you grind the beans. Wherever the hot water flows down and creates delicious, life-giving liquid, that's what the ideas are doing. Meanwhile, I'm usually trying to actually finish something else and really shouldn't be starting a new project. So let's see. After the idea has sort of fermented, now we're into mixing metaphors, I do a hand draft, which I've done several times sort of as a result of injury or illness. So when I was writing Thorn, I developed peripheral neuropathy, and I really struggled using my hands, especially typing. It's such a repetitive thing. So I found that I was able to actually handwrite a lot easier. So I did that, and typing it up was a pain in the ass, and I hated it. And I swore to myself I would never do it again. I didn't keep that promise. And so the benefit of hand drafting for me, aside from the fact that it's something that gets me away from the computer screen, which is really important for my health and mental health, is that when you're hand drafting, it's a different process. So when I'm typing, it feels different than when I'm handwriting, and the ideas come differently. I'm a much better writer when I'm typing. The words and sentences I make, they're just infinitely better. When I'm handwriting, I don't care as much, and that is really nice for a first draft because it allows me to get the ideas down, the scenes down, and then when I go back to edit it, I can look through and say, okay, that worked, that didn't work, and I just don't type that part up. And since I'm a writer who writes multiple drafts, like a lot of rewrites, that works for me. That being said, I have yet to find a free dictation program. I'm sure if I paid for a great dictation program, I would be in a different position, but typing it up is something that I do dread. The other thing that I do when I'm writing, and this is something a professor of mine recommended last year in my MFA program, is to keep a writing journal. So I gave a talk at a school, and they gave me this amazing little pirate notebook, which I've been using to sort of write about what I'm writing. And I cannot recommend this practice enough. It has changed the way that I've written. It's changed the way that I think about my work. It helps me work through ideas. I may even end up writing a little snippet of a scene in there, and yeah. So if you're not keeping a writing journal and you are stuck with a project or a short story or a novel or a poem, I would just write about it. Write about your problems. It will save your partner or your spouse or your friends from listening to you endlessly talk about the same thing over and over and over again. I know that's something that my wife, by like the 17th time I tell her the same problem, she's like, Anna, I thought we fixed this. So I keep a writing journal. And so once it's all typed up, then I then I sit there and I think to myself, awesome, I finished a draft. And I let that wonderful feeling sink in for about 5 minutes before I realize that everything's terrible and it has to be totally rewritten. So then I rewrite it. Usually by the second rewrite, I've figured out some of the major problems, and I might consider at that point sending it to a couple friends, and then I get their feedback, and then I rewrite, if not the whole thing, large chunks of it. And so by the fourth or fifth draft, it looks nothing like the handwritten draft that I initially produced. And I know writers who plan everything out ahead of time, and then they type up their little scenes, and it all looks beautiful, and it takes them probably a lot less time. And I envy them that, but that's not how I write. It doesn't work for me. Yeah, so what else do I do? And then I send it to my editor, and then I get it back, and it's full of lovely notes and marks, and I go through and I try and figure out what the hell I did wrong, which is usually a lot of stuff. And I love the editing and the revision phase. I think that's where you really start to hone your craft and figure out what you're trying to say. And another thing that I recently learned from a professor is, what did she say exactly? When you're writing, you're making a statement whether you mean to or not. And so it's really important to think about what you've written and make sure that it's saying what you want it to say, because it will say something, and what you don't say or don't include says something. And I think this is especially important when we're talking about including a diverse cast of characters, not for diversity's sake, but especially if you're writing speculative fiction. And we see this a lot with white, straight, male writers who write worlds that reflect their worldview. And that, I don't necessarily, I do fault them for that a little bit, but as a writer, especially a speculative fiction writer, who you include and who you don't include says a lot, and it will affect your readers. And as a member, I'm white, but as a member of the LGBT minority group, I notice that. And then when I read a book that really resonates with me, that I feel like, I can connect with, often because it has people like me, it makes a huge difference. And so, but that doesn't apply necessarily to just, what was I saying? I try and think about what I am saying and what I am unintentionally saying. And if that doesn't line up with what I want it to be, I definitely try and change that. Meanwhile, I'm usually writing a couple of different things as well. So if I'm working on a book on a deadline, obviously that takes priority, but I usually have 2 or 3 other side projects going at the same time. And I find that incredibly beneficial. I know it drives some people crazy, but when I'm working on, so when I was writing Compass Rose, which was my first book, I was also working on Thorn and Nottingham, which both were under different names at that time, so it's funny to think about. But I would get stuck on Compass Rose, and so I would take a break and I would work on one of my different projects. And usually while I was working on a different project, I would figure out what was wrong with, the plot in Compass Rose, like why wasn't Rose, and I don't know, I can't think of a specific example. There were so many problems with the book. So for me, multitasking allows me to sort of troubleshoot in the back of my mind. So if you're someone who that works for, I don't ever feel guilty about having multiple projects. If you're someone who that would drive totally crazy, don't take my advice and don't do that, because adding stress to your work I don't recommend that. So that is how I create fiction, and for better or for worse. So I hope that was somewhat insightful, and feel free to ask any questions, like, Anna, why are you so weird, why are you crazy? Maybe not ask those questions because I don't have answers, but anyways, I hope you enjoyed.